Good afternoon. Bon, merci beaucoup. Well, thank you very much for attending this afternoon session, which is of our conference. As for those of you who attended the plenary session this morning, I mentioned this workshop about the benefits of drug uses, and I think this is the idea of the organizers to attract participants in this workshop. And this morning we mentioned about with Jean-Christophe Allu the non-problematic use of drugs and the potential benefits drug use may have on people. And the idea of this workshop is to focus on this notion of benefits, not only non-problematic uses, and asking, can we really speak of benefits? And if yes, why should we do that? Let me introduce myself. I'm Perrine ROUX. I'm a researcher at INSER. I'm a public health specialist, and I lead a team of the CES team, research team in Marseille, who comes from experience to HIV. And, well, this is explains I was educated by my former head of team, who's Bruno Speer, well-known researcher, especially of HIV. I became his team leader. And Bruno taught me community and participative research in public health and the benefits of proposing this type of research to improve knowledge and action we can offer the groups we work with. So he greatly contributed to facilitate access to healthcare prevention and adapted prevention. And we have all the different elements of prevention that have been assessed with communities and groups working around HIV. And I started working on harm reduction. And thanks to that approach, I applied this to that domain and conduct studies, participative and community research, thanks to the creation of this AREN network that we created with Pierre several years ago, funded by IRES, an academic network which I also designed to work with the community and the self-support associations. So this network gathers researchers, users, or participants, members of a national self-support associations. So we're really speaking of self-support and not only harm reduction, because we couldn't host all the associations interested in risk reduction. So the idea was to connect academics and people who have this knowledge or experience-based knowledge to offer solutions in reality with to meet the reality of drug users. After the creation of this AREN network, we considered on several occasions through various seminars we have organized over the past 4 years, and we have had written this priority topic on the agenda of research, and this is why we are now focusing on benefits of drug use, and we'll be presenting some of our results. Up to you, Pierre. I'm Pierre CHAPPARD, the president of Psychoactive, which is an activity of people, and I'm a founding member of AREN with Perrine. And I would like to tell you about how at Psychoactive we have rediscovered this notion of benefit and how we introduced it into the AREN network later. At Psychoactive, we organize some weekends during which we work on harm reduction, and we were tired of always weight taken for walking risks because people only considered that we were risks. And that one day we said, but let's look at the positive or the benefits that people take drugs because they gain some kind of benefit from that. Around the table were sitting various types of consumers, and we don't claim that we can represent all people taking injection, all kinds of problematic recreative types of consumption or not. So this is important to have this in mind. I cannot tell you everything that came out of when we asked people, why do you take drugs? What are the benefits of drugs? But let me give you some of these elements. Finding one's way, making things more relative, questioning standards, acquiring skills, reducing skills of psychological disorders, knowing one's body, living new sexual experiences, restoring balance, expressing one's feelings, identity, opening, tolerance, more empowerment, and so we were already surprised to see all this list of benefits gathered because each of us, we were working separately. And that was the first time we were consulting and gathering all this list of benefits. And these are a posteriori benefits, and we had not considered when we were consuming. Later on, we asked, how can we name those benefits from drugs? Could we speak of benefits, motivation to using, function? And we question ourselves, motivation to using drugs? Because our people, but this is connected to awareness, whereas benefits may not, people may not always be aware of those benefits. It can be a mechanical, this can be fine for some people, speaking of function more than benefits. But what was striking was to see the benefits, because this means that people would gain from drug consumption, which goes 100% the opposite of what the society would tend to say, that drugs actually would diminish people. And that would go against the different policies. We also spoke of pleasure during that session, to say that it was a trap to speak of pleasure when speaking of drugs, because users are often stigmatized because they say people who want to enjoy themselves all the time. Mentioning pleasure would come back, send people back to that stigmatization, whereas the word benefits goes well beyond just the simple notion of pleasure. With that session, we also thought that benefits could correspond to all different types of drug users, includes when the recreative use of drugs. And it was very important not to recreate categories where you would have users having benefits and those who not have benefits, the good and the bad ones. If people take drugs, it's because they all find some kind of benefits. Even despite prohibition and stigmatizations, they have forgotten those benefits or they have lost meaning. And similarly, for precarious drug users, people who are homeless, they somehow find benefits by consuming drugs. That's a socializing from living in the street. That's going to be for them forgetting about their difficulties. There are benefits, even if, in brackets, for such drug, even for those drug users. So that was a great time of community resilience. We used to be working separately, thinking about those benefits, and we gathered all this information, and that was a great time of construction. This reinforced each of us individually, but also collectively. And we shifted from the status of witness of our own consumption to a group that was going to defend the benefits of drugs, to work with harm reduction policies. Something else I would like to mention about these benefits, they're not immediate for the users. But everything says about the opposite. Prohibition says they cannot be benefits. And so we were so excited when we discovered this collective say, okay, we'll post that on Psychoactive on our platform and ask the communities, what are the benefits for you? We had received some answers, but most of them had lost awareness of the benefits because stigmatization and prohibition was so strong that they had lost the meaning or awareness of those benefits. So they had to find out about the meaning, which needs to be done even when working on harm reduction. On the basis of all these concepts, later on we decided to share them, and this is when we became members of the AREN network with researchers and other members, and we felt this was somehow expected by the community of users, leaving always this discourse based on damages and risk associated with drugs. And thanks to Perrine, we started conducting research in which we integrated benefits as part of the questionnaires. And, well, this is still work in progress, but this will be the topic in the next presentation. But how can we introduce this notion of benefit to work on harm reduction? This is when we found this tool, balance and benefits risk. In every we'll speak of benefits between risk and benefits, except in drugs, when we'll always mention only the risks. And it's also not, we thought it would also be nice to reach this balance, to speak about this balance when speaking of harm reduction. Because when we will speak of this framework, standardized health approach, we do not listen to the user's voice. And so it is important. And this is what doctors do on a daily basis with all kinds of medicines, but you can do the same with drugs. It also works with substances. As a conclusion, what we can say is by reduction, the taboo associated with has not allowed us to to shift away from stigmatization. But as harm reduction rather concerns what is wrong, well, this keeps locking people in stigmatization. And speaking of benefits would be a way to fight stigmatization and give people more, to give drug users empowerment, because this gives meaning to their consumption. Harm reduction itself can be questioned because the word that sounds more is risk. And we will speak, it's a model in which we speak about only the damage, but not all the events. Whereas when reading literature, we discovered many colleagues, in particular the Correlation Network, had produced a similar article saying let's shift from harm reduction and let's speak about benefits, and even offer to go further and adding to harm maximization of benefits. And look and try to aim at aware consumption, because people must become aware of their consumption, and if we make them aware of their benefits, this would allow to leave this model only focused on risks and to go towards a more global approach, on the benefits, centered on the well-being of drug users. And as you know, this is a whole problem, a huge problem. A program ahead of us, sorry, program. Well, thank you so much, Pierre. So you see, in fact, how this whole, question of benefits started from, and this became our priority since our first encounters, and to have tangible action soon after that seminar in Rennes. We offered, as I said this morning, to add to our cohort a cohort of drug users. We were starting to analyze the use of drugs in France, and we decided to add a module of questions to document about those benefits as perceived by those users. And Julio will tell you about the analysis of the work done with this cohort. Please, can you show any slides? And in fact, is that the one? I said there.
So there's not a lot of literature on the benefits, a lot of scientific literature on cannabis for therapeutic reasons. A few articles on experimental psychology or neuroscience on the functions of the drugs, the cognitive functions, but it's very very scarce, and there's a neuropsychiatrist published an article. He wanted to launch a dynamic around research on non-problematic uses, but this dynamic really didn't take off. The article was complex, but it's interesting, I think, for neuroscientists or psychiatrists. There's an interesting theoretical framework justifying the importance of focusing on what he calls non-addictive uses, but uses which wouldn't necessarily lead to dependency. But we'll talk about the fact that even if you have use disorders, you can also have non-problematic uses. And that was the question that Serena asked this morning. And then in the social sciences, there's been quite a lot of work done by sociologists who've looked at the function of drugs in people's lives, and particularly in the LGBT community. The technology of the ego, as Foucault mentioned, talking about the way that some tools can become technologies to become emancipated and to improve your ability to act. And there's a lot of interesting sociological work on this. But this remains work which is not connected and doesn't lead to science of non-problematic uses or looking at benefits. Benefits remain something specific in non-problematic uses. Perhaps I could very quickly talk to you, and then Julia will be able to look at the Checknow cohort's results. But this Checknow cohort began in 2024. It includes 1,363 users that were recruited online. It's an e-cohort, and of course that means that it has its limits. It means that you can't find unconnected users, but it means that you can be effective in terms of users and choose users that are often invisible in surveys because they're users that we don't often find in the structures devoted to pathology or to the general population. These are going to be more or less regular recreational users who don't appear in any other studies, and we know little about their uses and their profiles. So as I said, we were able to add these questions. Do I have the list? This is the list of questions. We worked on this during the RN seminar. All the benefits that people could imagine that they could get from their drug use and the effects that they were looking for. So these are the immediate benefits, but as Pierre said, we also wondered how these benefits These benefits, people are not necessarily aware of them before they consume these substances, and we could perhaps integrate them into the long-term thinking and see the impact that drugs have on people's lives. So we thought we could try and list the long-term effects that we could see through the past use, your career as a drug user. There's a list here on identity challenges, about finding work thanks to your consumption, because of your experience that you've had, or to confront difficult times in life. So we took a lot of time listing all of these long-term benefits. And we're not going to present this because we haven't yet analyzed it, but Julio will be telling you something about the first analysis of the short-term benefits. I'm quite happy I've got them here. I'm not going to go in any depth into the description of this cohort because Julio will be presenting the results, and I'll hand over to you, Julio.
Hola.
Okay. No. So the idea, it's an interactive workshop, so feel free to ask questions, and I hope, yeah, we'll have time to discuss, for a discussion. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Julio Del Amo. I am a mathematician, statistician, as a team with Perrine ROUX about harm reduction, and I would like to speak to you about the characterization of benefits in connection with the use of drugs since the Checknow cohort. Okay, let me give you the context. We know that French policies and more generally around the world focus on the risk and social and complication of drug use and never speaking about benefits. There's very little information in scientific literature about benefits and motivations for use, but this study called the Validation of the Motivational Inventory Underlying Substance Use Engagement of 2022, which is a recent article, that still defines a few characteristics, just like emotional coping, cheating, dependence, severity. So there are some benefits here listed in literature, but more theoretical. And the question that emerged when we had these cohorts, how can we empirically characterize with data and people the different benefits they can find in drug use? So let me introduce the objectives of people. Well, sorry if I be repeating for those who attended yesterday's workshop, but the main objective of that cohort was to assess the efficacy of the analysis of drug users with people, drug users in France, with the reduction of undesirable events and the improvement of knowledge and empowerment. So I will not develop this in detail or not develop those secondary objectives. So we created this cohort that we gathered in November 2024, and people could fill in a questionnaire and have some posters to make this study more attractive and attract a large number of people. So people could fill in the questionnaires or in the different spots identified here. We were able to gather to 1,363 people. And some 100 individuals used those CARUD, the centers, and still we have access of people to go to those CARUD centers. To give you a description of the questionnaire, so there's about social demography questions to identify the people filling the questionnaire, the section about the benefits people looking for, by side effects. Side effects, the consumption of substances, general health data. And we have this general self-efficacy scale to measure empowerment, individuals' empowerment, and how people can act on their capacity to act. And also to know also if people ask for information about the drugs before consuming them or asking about drugs in general. And there was also part of the question relating to knowledge used of drug analysis. And to describe the cohort, as I said, we had a sample of 1,300 people. So we have the median age is 27, a rather young group cohort with a majority of men, women, trans and non-binary members, accounting for 10% of the group. And we're faced with people who have stable accommodation, and more than half of them are in employment. So this is not the typical population that comes to our cohort as we could have imagined, but they're more integrated drug users, if I may say. Now, looking at the benefits people were looking for, this is the key question here for our analysis. I'm going to list you those benefits. So people were looking for management increase in concentration, management reduction of tiredness, reduction of anxiety, stress, management, reduction of physical pain, of symptoms such as hallucination, facilitation of social intercourse, control of stopping drug uses, modification of their senses, of state of consciousness, benefits on food appetite, increase or improvement of sexuality or physical performance, access to a feeling communion with others, improvement of self-confidence. And so we used, in fact, this questionnaire, and this list of benefits was designed with members of a self-support association. So it was not created by a list created by researchers, but we worked with drug users. Well, this is important to point out, and it was a multiple choice questionnaire, and people could select one or all the items they wanted. The methodology I used the structural equation modeling, which is a mathematical model. So I will not go into details of the theory itself, but this model allows us to create latent classes according in connection with correlation of responses by the individuals. The number of people who said, for example, they use drugs to manage their anxiety, we had 200 people answering that and who said no for stress. Still, the majority of people who said they would use drugs to manage their anxiety, for more of them would also use drugs to manage stress, and vice versa. People, when you look at people who use drugs for stress management, would also use drugs for anxiety. So there's a very strong correlation. That is just one of the examples between the people who consume drugs to manage anxiety and stress, and so we're able to include those in a single family which we called emotional management. Is that clear to you? As I will explain with the other criteria. And after those variables, microphone, please. Okay, and so these were the people who said they were taking drugs to reduce anxiety or stress. And people also mentioned the same for stress. And so this is why we included them in this latent class, that's say a family of variables. And you will see this better on this example, which Perrine also explained during the plenary session this morning. And we, in fact, ended up with 3 latent classes. That's say emotional management, a therapeutical class, that's say people who take drugs to reduce physical pain, for better sleep, food benefits. I think people don't understand. In fact, this model allows to identify categories of benefits, which is broader and maybe easier to understand. And the other category was also looking for pleasure, to improve their feeling, state of awareness, pleasant sensation, communion, and cognitive performance, and people who are looking for better concentration, better intellectual performance and social performance, people who consume to fight fatigue and improve their socialization. And the innovation is that these families are not, in fact, we will not define them as researchers, but according to the responses of the individuals. And even if these make sense, because these are the families that were already defined in scientific literature, these are empirical. And people who take drugs to relieve physical pain would more likely use them for the other 4 benefits. So it means that people, this is an empirical demonstration that the category of benefits that were listed in literature also exist and can be found among the individuals. Also, something that comes from this model is that we can add exogenous variables which are not benefits, and they come from this questionnaire to every family or latent family. Here we see that people who take drugs for therapeutical reasons have a low efficiency score. And these people may already have problems with justice and who were directed to addiction therapies. And here we see we have a higher prevalence of trans and non-binary people coming from the LGBT plus community. And these are people who we found more frequently in addictology consultation. And also people who have low efficacy score, who are patients, addictology patients. And the last category are these people who go less often to those addictology because these people are more interested in more social interaction. They're usually younger. We'll find rather young people, high level of members from the LGBT plus category. And the last category, the people have this higher self-efficacy score, people with higher empowerment, who are more control of themselves, if I can say it's like that. These are young users who have an average or high, or at least higher than the average alcohol consumption. Also, a majority of them being from the LGBT plus community. So I think this is important. This one is the only one which has a high self-efficacy score. And when we look at this analysis of latent classes, what we can do is interconnect all different families of benefits with a secondary of drug families and side effects, which I connected by using the same model. So here the category includes ketamine, all psychologics, stimulants, so cocaine, speed, other types of LDMA, ecstasy, and so you have the idea, so you can identify the other types of families. So we see that people who consume drugs for emotional management would rather tend or turn to opiaceae, cocaine, crack, heroin, and other opiaceae, whereas they would less use. You can see the red line here. There is a negative correlation, and these people will, who use drugs for emotional management would rather turn to crack, heroin, opiaceae than stimulants. And this makes sense, and but this is rather correlated with a side effect on their mental health. For social performance, we see that these people rather turn to stimulants, even if they turn to opiaceae, cocaine, psychedelic drugs, and this is also connected with effects on their mental health, physical effects, and the category that use drugs to in search of pleasure is rather connected with stimulants and psychedelic, and there's a strong connection with the use of opiaceae, crack cocaine, and the therapeutical profile is rather this category that use drugs for pain relief. And the people who use drugs for cognitive performance will find a connection with opiaceae, cocaine again, and the lower correlation with the new synthetic drugs and psychedelic drugs. Ah, yes. Uh, I would like to know about the side effects. To me, you're speaking of acute effects. I find doesn't seem precise enough to me. But how do you separate mental effect and psychical distortion? And what about the effects with cocaine? Well, thank you. Yeah, this is true. So some results may be surprising about the side effects, but it is true that when I saw this is not corrected with opiaceae and cocaine, I was surprised because I think these are the effects which are more physical, but these are not correlated. And well, these four families were created on the basis of the benefits. And through this model, I didn't mention all the items because the table, the graph would have been extremely difficult to read and should have cognitive overload for a Friday afternoon. But we rather speak out those effects, psychic effects, just more paranoia, and rather turn to psychedelic drugs and people with mental health, interest in mental health or social people may lead to irritability, they say about people's mood, but not acute psychic distortion. Have I answered your question? And to speak about the severe effect, it's not there. These don't exist, but there are no differences between the categories. And this may be surprising. This is true. And this way of considering benefits may eliminate this duality between drugs and side effects, but add to a new dimension around these benefits that will also allow us to maybe reestablish the balance and say that this drug produces this side effect, but if you take that for a specific benefit, this can bring you something. But if you're not taking this for these other effects, you may have another result. And this may be a new paradigm to reconsider the benefits and risk. Let me speak about the prevalence of the different benefits. We also reached some interesting results when I spoke to you about this category of users looking for pleasure, people empowered who did not necessarily have problems and who are not addictology patients. We see this is the most important category with all the 4 items here being at more than 50% of the different mentions. And, you know, people had, that was a multiple choice questionnaire, so they could, you know, tick as many items as they wanted. So the second category we want is reduction of anxiety, also facilitation of social interactions. And we see here a sharp difference between the 35% access to feeling of communion with others or people interested in therapeutic effects. So there's the intent, the search for pleasure is more important compared also social interaction. And you look at the therapeutic effect, the cognitive effect remains rather marginal. Whereas now maybe if we had a population coming from CARU, the therapeutic effect would have been more marked. But when we represent, this is the reality that we have observed. 3 items who could not fit into that model, maybe due to a low correlation, such as improvement of sexuality, or maybe because very few people answered on that point, so we were not able to introduce that item in latent classes for statistical reason. But this is the table of results. So as a conclusion, this empirical analysis of the benefit in correlation with existing literature, theoretically, we can see that for the first time, this has been confirmed empirically that certain categories of benefits coincide to the fact that coincide to that. We've also observed different profiles in relation to those benefits, and also different substances and the side effects associated with the different benefits. And we must also take into account this dimension if you want to minimize or reduce the side effects. So patients should know the type of drugs, but also know about the motivations and the reasons. And this is just as important as the type of drugs people consume. But what we say that the most quoted benefit research people are researching at the search for pleasure, followed by emotional management and social performance. Thank you for your attention.
J'aimerais juste dire si
I'd like to say if we could go towards a paradigm change in the way of looking at these benefits, that would be an excellent progress. Questions?
Can I ask, did you do any factor analysis, and did any of those items just drop out because they correlated too much with other items?
the 3 grey items.
Of the 19 or 20 questions? So there's 19 or 20 items. So did factor analysis, of all those, are some of those so correlated that actually they fell out?
The grey ones.
So those ones, okay, yeah. The other thing is that the effects of all drugs, it's not just the drug, it's not just the individual, but it's also the social context. And social context changes all the time. And this is a yes-no answer. Did you consider it be not so much a yes-no, but a never, sometimes, always, which reflects that I might use a drug and get a certain benefit now, but tomorrow morning, if I use the same drug, that would be a disaster because I've got to get and go to work.
Yeah, okay.
So, did you think of, the ability so for it not to be a yes-no, but a, and if that would then change, I guess, some of the subsequent analysis.
Thank you for your question. Actually, well, the grey ones actually wasn't, for those two, it was so marginal, the effect that, I mean, we couldn't put in a category, and this one, it was like pretty isolated, so it couldn't enter in the model. And for the instead of putting a binary answer instead of a Likert scale with that, I mean, I think it will be richer, but I also think that the categories wouldn't move so much because if it's like, how do you say? It's not a pretty precise analysis, but we have enough people. We have 1,300 people. So instead, we can just use brute force and have, in my opinion, pretty good and pretty consistent results. I mean, even with a Likert scale, maybe some things will change, but I think that the families will stay pretty much the same, in my advice. But it's a very good question. Thank you.
Thank you. And very quick clarification. In what time frame? So is this, is it in the last week of your drug use, in your last month of your drug use? Because my experience of the drugs I used 2 years ago is different to my experience of the drugs that I'm using now. So was there a time frame for this? In the last week, the positives or random?
Yeah, it's habituellement, so is usually. We didn't explain so much, so it's probably the present because there are some bias of time, so yeah, but we didn't specify.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, ce qui serait intéressant, est-ce qu'on peut comparer?
Can you compare the same questions with healthcare professionals? Because here we have the view of people, and we can see emotions and consumption. It'd be interesting to ask the healthcare professionals how they see the interest of such and such a substance. And I think that we would have differences. And I think it would be interesting. I don't know if that's clear. See, the people who support these people, accompany these people, see how, in terms, for example, of stress management and so on, what they think about that, what would their perspective be. So the hypothesis is that it would be rather discordant. I think this would make it easier to confront different representations to reduce the gap between the two. But I find this model is extremely interesting in starting out from the field to model these responses. I had a question in line with the first presentation. I'm a care professional and an addictologist and also a researcher. And thank you very much for the psychoactive site that gives a lot of access to experiences and knowledge, even including from Belgium. How do you see this paradigm change from harm reduction towards looking much more towards benefits in the future? How do you think that can change? Well, we're still in the early phases. We're moving forwards, but we're very much in the early stages. For the moment, we're not the only people doing that. We can see that in Europe and in France, there are other people who are beginning to include the notion of benefit. So we see that there really is something there that's worth working on. But we also need to say that we're in a prohibitionist state. They don't know the benefits. Research, fortunately, has mentioned benefits, because otherwise, since the research is funded by the state, researching for benefits is not in the front line. I don't have the answer yet, but the first thing, I think, is to educate users. That's what we do with psychoactive, so they can consciously look at the benefits, and we can see the damage that prohibition is causing. It removes the whole meaning of consumption, and this is a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So we're just at the beginning, trying to find the tools. I would just add, with regard to that, you were talking about users, but you have to talk about healthcare professionals. They need to be made aware of these ideas. There are centers and places where they have the support staff. That's not the majority, but I think it's very important they should be aware of that. And it's important that it should be part of the training courses. That should be part of the training that's given in the centers that we're working in, so they can see that gap. That goes through the teaching that you can get about studying these benefits. But I think that clearly in this, from this point of view, I think you're bearing this in mind. But we have to reduce the gap, have an approach looking both from the view, the perspective of people who are using these substances and the hair people, and also in terms of public health, that's essential. And perhaps before we hand on to Muriel, who's going to talk about her clinical practice and the benefits in the clinic, in clinical practice, I'd like to share an article that we published some time ago concerning alcohol, with regard to Fadi's question about the discordance between the perception of the doctor and the patient's perception. We compared the consumption of alcohol in HIV patients and hepatitis patients. The consumption declared by the patient and declared by the doctor. We asked the doctor, in your view, what is your patient's consumption? And the data were concordant when they were talking about an HIV doctor, because these were doctors who used to doing research within the community. They knew the challenges for the patient, and patients were more ready to declare their consumption. So I think it's clear that there needs to be education amongst healthcare professionals. And research also is a way of educating and making users more conscious of what they're doing, because they can then say the benefits and say, yes, there can be benefits. So it's a way of communicating the fact that there can be benefits. There are also tools. Good afternoon. Thank you for having invited me. And thank you for talking this way about support. I'm Muriel GREGOIRE. I'm a psychiatrist and addictologist. I'm responsible for a unit in Aix-en-Provence, and I also work with colleagues in Paris, and I also have a consultation in Marseille on the issue of chemsex, and I've been doing that for a number of years. So here I'm going to talk about my place as a doctor, as a psychologist. I also talk about the other part of the question of the consumption of psychoactives, and from the point of view of benefits. When I started studying, I came in, we talked about uses that we don't often talk about, recreational uses, simple uses, abuse, and going down to dependency. There was a kind of hierarchy, which is quite interesting, because that did leave space to talk about the user's perspective, and we had a less health-based or pathological-based perspective on use. I arrived, it was addictology and also toxicology, but addictology could destigmatize use of illegal substances. It didn't work too well completely, but so when I worked for 11 years in Paris. The first job we had to do there on addiction was not the DSM and so on. It was the subjective feeling. It was very interesting, because that gave an idea about the person who was consuming, and not necessarily the vision of the healthcare professional who could say you're an addict or you're dependent or whatever. So we can see that there are consequences, but the feelings of the users are absolutely essential. And then I had the impression that I was talking about the benefits in consultations, and I was also talking about the other functions of uses in practice. Perhaps that's what I learnt. What does the substance do? What use do you make of it, and what does it bring you? That's one of the first questions that we often ask, and I continue to ask. And that's what we tell our interns that they should be asking. Sometimes the users say, well, cocaine does this. I didn't ask what cocaine does. I say, what does it do to you? It depends at what time in your life you take it. Depends on your personality and so on. It changes the effects that you feel and the benefits that you feel. And this means that you can better understand what drives users to consume and to start again, and perhaps even develop addiction. But experiments and regular use doesn't necessarily lead to addiction. I know that you looked at the percentage of people, between 10 and 30% of people who consume run the risk of addiction or problematic use. But again, it would be interesting to redefine the question of problematic and what that means. There was a lot of work being done on the addictogenic potential of substances. For cigarettes, maybe 50%. So heroin is a bit lower. So all of these are very interesting things to bear in mind. I tended to observe with experience that the more the product had a self-therapy function, the greater the risk of addiction. But then the risk of addiction doesn't necessarily mean it's problematic, except when you have substances which over time have consequences, and that's something we cannot deny. And so this is why harm reduction is also based on that. It's not just talking about risks, but allowing people, if they need to continue to do it, at least they can continue to do that with as few risks as possible, as little risk as possible. We could talk about pleasure, and that's what you were saying, Pierre. If we have pleasure, usually that's fine. But then you take a substance, I don't know, alcohol or cocaine or whatever, LSD for other people, the pleasure might be stronger. And it might lead to euphoria and so on. So obviously it's quite human to want to do it again. I think that human beings do that. There's nothing abnormal there, nothing pathological. But if in life you no longer feel any pleasure, perhaps because you're depressed or whatever, so you want to go back there perhaps more often, particularly if it's the only way of getting any pleasure is to do that. And that is how in our therapy we can also try and see with people whether there aren't other ways for them to get pleasure, so that the drugs don't take all the place in their lives. Same thing, I remember a situation, one of the first people that I followed up, he took ecstasy, first time in his life, and he had such an intense pleasure, ecstatic pleasure, that it caused a real trauma for him in terms of his psychology. It completely disturbed him very, very profoundly. He didn't have any problems with addiction, but he didn't know where to go. He didn't understand DMA and so on, but he came to see us to work on this question some time ago. So this is another situation. And the question of the genesis of addiction, there are three things. A person in a context, it's always important to see the social context in which you are. It's essential we're not individuals alone in our little room somewhere, and with specific substances. So those are the three elements. The same person can use the same substance at a different time in his life and not have the same benefit, and not even be looking for the same benefit, and not be confronted with the same risks. So that's the question of being aware of the effects and benefits or negative effects. But it rarely happens immediately. This often takes several years. Sometimes it's not so important, but sometimes it is. 2002 was the first time I was in the second year of my internship, and there wasn't so much heroin. A lot of people using TSO, substitution therapy, and the action is maybe antidepressive, anxiolytic, and it can be antipsychotic, has a real function. There is a real benefit. And we realized, as when we asked people about this, he said, what was it that meant that they took heroin? Well, some of them said that it meant that for years they were able not to go down into psychosis and to be there for other people, to fight against depression. Not everybody had access, but it wasn't the case before, to care. You don't necessarily want to go and see a psychiatrist. It's not always effective either. Heroin had the effect of to try and sort of plug certain gaps and deal with certain suffering. And again, back in Paris, I thought about my beginnings in addictology when I was preparing this presentation. talking about behaviors, when people try and explain how they decided to develop the ideas that they had people who were doing overdoses, but he said they don't want to suicide, they want to commit suicide. So there must be people who may have self-destructive impulses, but it's not the majority. So there was something there, perhaps a kind of more lively vision of use and even risk-taking. I think it's very important as a psychiatrist to saying that people are not trying to commit suicide. There's something else happening, and people who want to live and want to feel something rather differently. Take the example of TUF. Perhaps I have another. I was doing my first course in addictology. I was a volunteer doctor in the 2000s for several years, and I arrived because somebody was saying it was an environment that I knew before I started working in psychiatry. They said it'd be good if you could come along and do some voluntary work. So it was one of the missions that I did. It was in the community, and also for my work in psychology and or psychiatry. We had the world doctors and so on. Most of the people who were volunteers at Médecins du Monde came from that milieu, and so they were accustomed to the culture and had a very interesting approach. And they were very open, and most of the things that we did there was just for dealing with minor ailments and sometimes bad trip management, but most of it was fairly simple. Sometimes there were some more complex situations. Very, very rarely we had to evacuate the people, do medical evacuation, but that happened very rarely. And then what are people doing in parties? They want to go to parties, teuf, as they say, a fête, a party. What are they looking for in parties? What are the police actions, the legal actions taken around parties? It's people say, let's go. They said, let's go and see what's going on, and go and get to the heart of things, be close to reality, and not just interpreting things. Go and see what's actually happening in the field. Most people have sort of just occasional use. There was all sorts of uses, in fact, which was much more focused on benefits. And there was also the question of freedom that was an important aspect, and it's increasingly important in our world today. So these were particular times and moments as perhaps suspended time. You're talking about sexuality, products that you can use to help discover yourself. I've been working on chemsex for now 15 years. I can see sometimes the very complicated side to chemsex and all the consequences that can have. But there are also some other things. Some people have actually been able to assert themselves as gay, for example, because the substances they took enabled them to do so. So sometimes there are effects that can be there. And I think this is the question of meaning and to restore meaning to their use of these substances. And even when it goes wrong a bit, it means that in the therapy, it's very important to be able to look back at that. And I tried to find the limitations of what the substance can provide. And there's, of course, the major myth is tolerance. These are psychoactive substances, but it has an effect on the brain. It's a kind of game that you play with your brain. But if you continue doing it, it's like if you continue gambling. If you gamble, roulette or even Russian roulette every week, it's no longer going to have the same effect. This effect, when you can actually identify it, if it's addiction, it's more complicated. Sometimes it's more difficult than working with a casino or something. In the consultations, when I arrived, I listened to the users, and they're actually the people who are going to teach you things. Talking about chemsex again, I'd been working in Paris for some time, and I had certain habits with certain users, and some people were using psychostimulants, I think, that people are aware of. The way that it was used, I didn't know, so just listened to people and with a very open mind. And that meant, once again, that there were benefits, But the issue around people's phobias about the community, you need to understand that so you can work on something else. Management is not just medical, it's also much broader than that. It's psychological, but also societal. That's something that we have very little control over. And use is very often very societal, and that's something you should never forget. First questions is to say, what are the first desires you had? Is it pleasure? Is it hedonism? Or is it managing your emotions? I think there are a lot of things that you saw on your slides. Plenty of reasons why people use. Curiosity, creativity, that comes up very often. There's certain difficulty to restore creativity when you stop using the substances. And even if there are sometimes a lot of negative effects. Obviously, it's somewhat biased because I see people who already have problems and who at least are asking questions. They're not all addicts. Sometimes they're 17, 18, 19, 20-year-olds. Some of them have more uses that they think are risky uses, rather more than addictive. So it's interesting to see people at that time, and they come for much shorter periods of time than those who come in to see us much later in their experience. So I think it's very important for people to be aware of what they're looking for. And I think in all these parties, all the artistic side to things, whether it's dancing, decoration, or living artists and so on, sublimation in partying. And I think that, I don't know if you know Taz, these spaces, they're special party spaces of temporary independence. If you're a young adult and there's lots of constraints in your life, these spaces, even when you're older, it can also be such fun to go to these places. And some people decide to live more like that. And some people experience it very well. The substances are powerful. They can bring pleasure, a sense of community. Sometimes there's an addictive risk, sometimes psychological risks. LSD, if you're a bit fragile and you take it too often, psychiatrists know what can happen. We've seen sometimes problems that can occur, and we've seen decompensation, cases of depression, people taking ecstasy every weekend. After a while, your brain doesn't produce enough serotonin. So these are things, if you want to do harm reduction, this harm reduction is there to avoid not just taking risks, but maybe continue to consume and with as little danger as possible. Obviously, there's a change in practices, a change in the substances, we can say. There's DS now. I take the example of partying. Ketamine was practically only found in that environment, intermittently except in England. But you can see uses. People wanted to travel. People wanted to dance. I've seen over the last 3 or 4 years a very abundant offer of ketamine. So we have things that we haven't been seeing over the last few years. This has very direct consequences. So we can see that depending on time, things can change. Somebody who regularly drinks, obviously it's not a problem for everybody to drink alcohol. If you drink very regularly for years, you may have cognitive disorders or neurotoxic disorders, for example. There are things like that which you need to be looked at, but information and harm reduction can serve that purpose. There are benefits that people can experience, but these benefits can also be limited. For example, talking about heroin, after a few years it doesn't work. Ketamine, which can take you on a trip, but the tolerance means that you don't trip anymore. Cocaine and cannabis, that means that you're a bit euphoric when you go out for the evening, doesn't work anymore. Same thing with TDH, and purposely, people who are on replacement therapy, wrote a paper about people who stop substitution. That's something that not enough is written about. This substitution therapy can be for life, or it can be just a tool used at some point in people's lives. When I see people who take cocaine and have 100 milligrams methadone, there's something that's not going right. But this is something which does actually exist. A lot of users have smoked crack every day, and that raises questions about the place of the substance. We can all, I think, question that and challenge that. The English say drugs. They don't make a distinction between drogue and médicament. It's just drugs, and I think that's an interesting concept. So I come to the conclusion, if I have a conclusion. The question of benefits and the risk-benefit ratio. It's absolutely essential to study the benefits and to understand the desire of users and see what is the psychological function of substance use. I think a psychoanalyst who wrote on the addictive solution, talking about the use of substances as a solution and not as a problem. Because we talked about the emotions a moment ago. If the emotions are impossible to cope with, this is somebody who met a lot of addicts. I think it's an interesting idea. I think that the idea it's the addictive solution is a very interesting approach. And she wrote that some time ago. So when we have people who are asking for help and perhaps trying to stop, try to understand the benefits and try to become aware of what they're looking for, I think that is going to help. But to finish, the principle of support is freedom of choice. I heard somebody saying the idea of psychological democracy. And this freedom of choice, choice to use substances or not use substances, and support for me should be seen within this perspective. But it's important, therefore, to study the benefits, and support staff need to look at those experiments and become familiar with that culture. I think that there are few doctors who've never drunk a glass of alcohol or whatever. You don't necessarily have to have taken all the substances to feel that there are effects, that there are benefits. Maybe one day if you're a bit sad, you're not feeling so well, somebody has gone or somebody's died or whatever. We've all had experiences where if we look at our own experience, I think that's important too, where substances have helped. And I think in human beings, we're looking for things that are good rather than self-destructive behaviors. And I think as an example, and I'll finish on that, when I started working with new synthetic products and chemsex, there are various substances, and then there was mixtures that came on the market in 2015, NRG 1, 2, or whatever. This was a form of catenone which was has more psychotic effects, very dopaminergic. And people found it completely, they became completely paranoid, whereas they weren't paranoid before. But these mixtures, it lasted for a few months, and very quickly it disappeared, and people stopped buying it. It's like 3-CMC not so long ago for chemsex. People took it, but then they had abscesses on their arms. They felt very bad, and most users didn't want 3-CMC anymore. So I think that you need to approach this from that perspective.
Well, thank you so much, Muriel, for this clinical testimony. Yeah, any comment? Yes, I would just like to speak about the difference between benefit and function. To me, it's about the same thing, except that I'm also the head of unit, We have some users who, when they're not doing well, they cannot and don't want to hear about benefits and say, see, I'm not doing well. Why are you speaking of benefits? And then when you speak of function, this is a more neutral term, but to me it's about the same. So even politically speaking, it's not the same. But from the clinical point of view, it's about the same. When speaking of clinical practice and benefits, I have the example of a person who's been under codeine for 20 years, who's doing well. He or she takes codeine daily, and then her doctor retired, and then she went to a SAPA, and the doctor she met didn't even listen to her, and she said, okay, so we'll prescribe Subutex instead of codeine. And codeine Subutex are not at all the same dynamic. And then the woman became depressive, she's not feeling well, and so she was prescribed antidepressant. And from now on, so the whole cycle went until we lost track of her. But what did she want? In fact, she just wanted codeine. And so if we had listened to her, the whole thing would have remained very simple. But for that, I mean, it would have required the doctor to listen to her. And in her case, the use of codeine was beneficial. Yes, I would like to speak more of a comment you mentioned about societal benefits for society. We also have in mind this individual and collective risk. I think it would be interesting to have more studies about individual, but also collective benefits. We also speak a lot about the cost of drugs in terms of productivity loss, but we don't evaluate, assess actually what they can bring in terms of productivity, the effect of cocaine on performance. If you want to shift paradigm, say we should also make the equivalent of David Nutt's study on the benefits, for example, cocaine, TDH, less impulsivity, less aggressivity. Have you worked on that? There's a lot of data for this connection between drugs and work. So we have not worked, even if we have a little data in this Checknow study. We would like to work with sociologist Gladys Lust, who's a specialist of drug at work, and she explains how drug consumption should not be perceived as a professional risk, but to understand better the working conditions and how this is a reflection of complicated or difficult working conditions. And the use of drugs would be the response to those constraints at work. There's still a lot to be done, but unfortunately we have very little information, and we will try to study this phenomenon. Of course, many people take drugs in order to be, to hold at work, but still remain productive. And, social connection, and also the fact that drug help improve social interaction. So there's no direct cause proven, but COVID has shown how the loss of social interaction impacted negatively on people's mental health. And consumption is reduced when young people, after, because the reductions, it does mean, but the use of drug is often connected to social interaction, and we tend to forget that type of benefits. Thank you for these presentations. I am Mahasha Lamet. I work in the penitentiary sector. For 2 years, I've been running a collective workshop for patients who have addiction problems in prison. I'm a trust. I work in behavioral therapy, and we always work on this decision or balance. And in prison, there's a lot of loss of lack of activity, boredom, and people would say they take substances to forget about boredom. And I like when you're speaking of aware consumption. This is a solution, but it is not the unique consumption. There are other ways to manage emotions, to manage my sleep, and my sleep is not about the products, but it's also connected with food, physical exercise, all these elements. It is interesting to say because, well, focusing too much on unique solutions is a risk. And we must not forget this is a solution the patient identifies, but what alternative solutions can we bring in that the patient may not accept, but how can we bring other solutions? I think you shouldn't think instead of the users. If they take drugs to sleep, why? Who are we to tell them they shouldn't be taking drugs to sleep? Once again, this is approach, yeah, drugs are negative and you can end up badly. If I take people work in a SAPA and people come on their own will and they ask for a different kind of support because they can no longer cope. But this is true. But going to tell people and tell them this is how you should or should do. I'm a doctor, I'm a psychologist, but I'm very much aware of the side effects of drugs, medication. And what really questions me is that the treatments are not questioned. Over years, people are prescribed antidepressants, neuroleptic medication, and say, wow, you have a list of 6 medications on your prescription. We no longer know who is doing what, and people take the products now because they're to wake up, because they have used too many sleeping pills. And so medication and drugs sometimes, can be dealt with, but considered the same way. I totally agree. We always speak about the patient for sleep. Yeah, this is true. We say, no, you should do this or that. That's not what I wanted to say here. We're here to give support from the patient's viewpoints and the benefits as perceived by the patient and not what we would recommend. So we cannot say, I agree with you. This is what I meant. And this is also I reacted because otherwise we'd be losing the person's benefits and replacing them by nothing and placing people even in greater difficulties. So we must listen to the patient. And sometimes we lack means to do that. And it's only if we need to have available people to listen to the people, or when they're seen only every 2 months, it's not the fault of the psychiatrist. The fact is we're lacking the same in other centers or SABA. It is more difficult to listen to people, but we must be careful and try to keep that time to listen to them.
Thank you for your presentation. What's always important, what we find helpful, is we ask people, what are your goals? What do you want to accomplish? What's not going right? What's getting in the way of your personal goals at the moment? And we help them figure out what that is. And through a discussion, it tends to be, people come to us because they can no longer manage their drug use. As you can't manage your drug use, other things happening in your life that they want to fix. So we ask them, what's the goal? What do you want to fix? And how can we help that? And through deducting certain things, there's a cause and effect. Certain things have to be minimized and eliminated to help you reach your desired goals. And in many times it happens to be the drug use or the sexual activities for chemsex and things. So if we could help people minimize the drug use and slowly reach their goals, that's great. If they realize they can't do that, minimizing their goals, and they might have to eliminate it because it becomes a big risk, then that's what we work on. I think it's about putting the treatment plan in the client's hands, and it becomes a negotiated process. And it's not really happening a lot. A lot of people just tell them what you need to do. And yeah, so that's like the whole harm reduction approach. And I'm glad that you were talking about that as well and what you guys are trying to do. Yeah, thank you.
Merci, Jason. C'était un commentaire.
Thank you for your comment. How can we trigger, in fact, this thought about the benefits? How can we launch that in research? Some researchers launched this questioning before us, but in fact we want to go together towards projects concerned with the benefits, not only epidemiology, sociology, and we have to work on a multidisciplinary approach. And I think the other workshop on addictology health, addictologists are thinking about the non-problematic use of drugs with people who have non-problematic use. And I suggested Marc Auriacon, who invited me to come to his workshop, and so he didn't know I was dealing here with rather similar issues. I suggested him to come meet together and see what we discussed about today. I think it is essential to launch this debate. Also in the education to people who consume or who are going to consume drug, and that was a suggestion a colleague, Salim Meja, he saw the results Julio showed you about the benefits and complications to show that to young people. They're saying these are the risks that have been clearly identified, and we know the times when we could do some prevention presentations in schools, but you can also say about what people will feel when they start consuming. I think we should also educate children, young people about the reality that they may experience. But of course, we do not want to make the apology of drug use. And especially the young people or pre-teenagers, the notion of risk for them does not mean so much, because when you speak to them about a cancer, they may get some, many years later. So, and even only those who are in searching for sensations, if you show them, the products, 20% say, well, still, I want to try it. And the other ones, so we have to change our presentation. This is true. In Belgium, we have a lot of fear from parents' committee about world presentation of drugs, speaking about drugs or sexual health. And of course, everybody wants us to speak of risk, and this is what they expect us to do. But this is true, but we're only giving only part of knowledge. But this is what we're not telling young people the truth. So how would they trust adults, and prevention messages? And I found this is totally counterproductive, because the very first thing they learn about they lied to me, and everything they told me about drugs was bullshit, And I wanted to establish connection about what you said yesterday. In yesterday's workshop, you spoke of alternative use of drugs. I think this notion of alternative use with minors or all types of consumers can open a new, broad avenue that would allow everybody to find their way and to dare to talk. As you said, we have to leave this notion of bad usage, but I think you rather speak of alternative use of drugs, and this would mean more to more people. When speaking of bad use means there are no benefits, and we must eradicate drug use. The TSO, right? But in fact, if nobody uses a drug in an alternative way, it's also to help people come back to the benefits. Whether they inject a drug, Subutex or methadone, still they will not buy from dealers. They will have access to the healthcare system, and there are benefits for them to use alternative forms of drugs. So when you're speaking of a bad use, you're losing everything, and we're losing the meaning of use. So I totally agree with you. Question from Fabrice. It's not a question. I just wanted to make a reminder here. I'm a member of Techno Plus, and I would like to remind that Techno Plus between 2003 and 2005 was sued to facilitate facilitation to the use of drugs because we were speaking of those benefits expected to the people. And I think, of course, well, this was so many associations were reluctant or harm reduction specialists became aware, and they had this long negotiation to make sure they would not be sued. And so they have understood, so said, yeah, be careful. Yeah, we're working on harm reduction, but don't speak too much about benefits. And this is interesting to see, to think about non-problematic uses. But when I work in this environment of people who are in parties, yes, of course, you can only see benefits. People are having fun during the parties, meeting other people, lots of social interactions. This is what we point out in our flyers, and they are used well beyond this specific environment of parties. And you can find them, you know, in driving school or in school, you know, nurses department. They say you are saying, because you're not trying to teach people, and people find about also the effects they expect, and this is why they trust us when we speak about drugs. So I think we have to speak about all the benefits of harm reduction has been to give objective information. And so maybe when discussing about this, when do we measure the impact of harm reduction? This is the eternal question of how can we measure the impact of such policies. And in the parties in this festive environment are our actions receive less funding because the regional health agencies tell us that we have not seen any objective results because we're working with young people, and this has not been assessed as something that allows for better management of drug use. Another comment I would like to make as well is about Alain Roux, he's from Quebec, who has written just like a school workbook that be use of drugs, and it should be just like a course, and he explains the central nerve system, substances, the benefits to the young people, and this would be directed to a high school student or secondary school student.
Thank you. I guess following on from some of these thoughts, we can be very critical of an approach that historically has only looked at harms. And you can see the challenges of trying to promote a scale to be widely used, which only looks at benefits. Have you contemplated or have you thought of integrating a scale or a measure or a tool that is more about consequences or impacts of your drug use, so that it combines the ability to assess the positives or the good things about your drug use and the not so good things about your drug use, which then actually I think is more useful anyway with an individual, because all drug use has good and bad. To think it's only ever good or only ever bad is naive and myopic, and we should be critical of that thinking also. So integrating a good and a bad, which then also allows, that becomes more instructive for the individual about where is your drug use now. And then an important thing then is also to look at linking it to a time frame. So it's not just in general. So a time frame which then allows you to do sensitivity to change. So if things change in your life, you may start a harm reduction program, you may start going to the gym, COVID may happen and the drugs dry up, whatever it is, that we can then use the tool to measure change, which then allows you to look at the impact of an intervention, the impact of a law that changes in the society, however you want to do that. Your ability then to look at the impact of drug policy, drug interventions, whatever, both from a good and a bad. So they're just some initial thoughts. That said, the sensitivity to change is important from a psychometrics. You need your mathematicians to help with that, to look at being able to, if things change, do we pick it up and how are we picking it up? And recognizing that something may happen, may increase the good things, but it may also increase the bad things, or vice versa.
Ouais, bien sûr.
Du coup, par rapport à ça,
So Fabienne talked about that, that having a consumption book, a logbook. So in your use logbook, you can note down what you've used, what were the effects, did you take it properly or not. I think it's a good tool to talk about the benefits and risks. And the idea maybe would be to add a measurement scale that could be associated with our projects over the long time frame, so that we can measure things with regard to structural variables. What is it that makes it the effect of use is going to change? The effect of that use is going to change for those people.
The harm questionnaires that exist, they all have the same items. They're all measuring the same. The harms are usually the same kind of harms. It's easy to come up with a list of harms. It's been done many times before. So you could go and get your cannabis problem questionnaire, your heroin problem questionnaire. These questionnaires, there's many of them. And they, when you look at them, they're all asking more or less the same questions. So it would not be hard to come up with the balance. You know,
Let's work on that.
Yeah.
Bonjour.
Good afternoon. I'm Nicolas. I'm a user more than anything else. And when I hear you talk, there's an impression to hear Henri Michaud and the Infini Turbulent. Do you know that book? The Infini Turbulent is a magnificent book, and it describes doses of mescaline on the left, and on the right, he talks about his experience, and not talking about Baudelaire and so on. How can you explain in a country like France, which has a culture of drug use, whether it's hashish, opium, whatever, how is it that we can be so little objective and so many reactionary policies rather than an objective approach that you have? That's a good question. I don't know whether it's Descartes or a poor explanation of Descartes with this reasonable side, starting out from reason. But I do have the impression that in the Anglo-Saxon world, there's perhaps more pragmatism. Things are not necessarily done, I don't know. But they don't have a priori prejudices, certainly more than in France. And if you talk about something that doesn't appear to be bound by reason, if you're talking about spirituality or the psychedelics, a typical example, you were beginning to see treatments using psychedelics, like ketamine, for example, is given for resistant depression in certain hospitals. I have two people that I'm following up. They have this treatment in another hospital because I can't give that treatment, but they're giving AS ketamine, and they said they should sit in a corner somewhere, maybe in the corridor, and so they can have their trip. And beyond the neurobiochemical effects, there's another effect, and that effect is not ever spoken about, as if it didn't exist. And people come and see me the next day, and we have interviews the next day after these sessions so they can talk to me about what they feel, and we can discuss this together. So typically, they don't there's something which is even denied Henri Michaud and his psychedelic journeys. I don't know. I think that in the Anglo-Saxon countries, I think there's maps.org talking about these psychiatrists in the 1960s and 70s. A lot wrote about the psychedelic effects of substances, which in France has been pretty rare. It does exist, but it's been very, very rare. Thank you for this very open question. There's no real answer to that.
Listening to your description of talking to patients about the effects of drugs, and I was quite fascinated. And I think you summed it up very well when you were talking about going in with a very open mind about what you are asking about. But in fact, the system of medical education, and maybe it's not dissimilar for nursing or psychology education, teaches the opposite when it comes to drugs. It doesn't teach an open mind, and it selects out the people who do have an open mind, don't get into medicine, and don't end up studying addiction. And in fact, when we train doctors to be specialists in addiction, some of it is helping them unlearn prejudices that they already have. Do you have any more insights on how can we do this better?
J'ai pas tout compris. I don't understand everything. Tu peux me traduire?
Non, mais j'ai pas tout saisi. Ah, voilà.
Ah, obtus.
Voilà.
I have the answer. Do people remember the movie Serpico with Al Pacino? Serpico. He's an undercover policeman who in New York, and he discloses all this police corruption. But he shows at the beginning of his police training, one of the things they do at the police with all the graduates, they line them out and they give them all one marijuana joint as the police officer. So they have to each smoke one marijuana joint as part of their police education. So maybe that's one of the things we should be thinking. As part of medical education, you must have at least one dose of opiates, one dose of heroin, one dose of LSD, one dose of cannabis.
One dose is not enough.
True, it's a start. One dose is never enough. And as for, you think Anglo-Saxons have got good drug policies? I think drug policy is shit everywhere. And the grass is greener on the other side.
It's not policy, it's about more, I don't know, but you use medicine more long time in some countries. Not in France, but it's not from policy. I agree with you for sure.
Moi, c'est une autre réponse parce que je me suis intéressée.
It's another answer because I think it's interesting to talk about the experience in Belgium. I don't think that all medical students necessarily have, I don't think those representations. It's the curriculum which progressively forges those representations and approaches. The problem is to go to the top level, and the teachers who are responsible for defining the curriculum. It seems complex, but it's the formal curriculum, the informal curriculum, the hidden curriculum, hidden agenda of that education. These are things that need to be worked on. There's a lot of work still to be done to have things changed at the top.
On a des postes d'internes dans le XAPA, et donc c'est un XAPA.
We have some jobs for interns in psychiatry. Some of them come in just to do a couple of terms of addictology to see what it's like. But I think the team is quite proud that some of them say, well, actually, it's pretty interesting. And they had an image of addiction and addictology which was extremely closed and blinkered. So, and I think the generations are changing. but there's still a lot of work to be done on education and training. When I was an intern, I had 1 day, or not even 1 day, 2 pages on addiction and substance use. The Academy of Medicine doesn't yet recognize substitution therapy. So for them, substitution therapy is just for a few people and to stop. So we're a long way from saying, what are we going to do about people using substances? Sorry, I can't hear if he doesn't use a microphone, but... And all of this is based on the bullshit of addiction as a disease. Thank you very much for the discussion, I think, which strengthens us and confirms us in the idea that we should continue on our journey towards studying the benefits. Thank you, all of you, for taking part, and have a safe journey home, wherever you're going to.